Also, if you'd like to join the Equity Committee by WIELD, be sure to check us out on our website, equitybywield.com. There's committee sign up. You can subscribe to our newsletter. Also, check us out on social media at Wield Your Story. And schedule events. So this afternoon, we're going to kick it off with with a presentation and by Tarquette. Then we're going to kick off with 3 speakers. We'll have an intermission so y'all can use the restroom, grab water, all that good stuff, where we'll actually have 2 raffle giveaways. Then we will have 2 more speakers followed by a moderated Q&A session. And then we'll wrap up with 1 more giveaway. So make sure you stay on the whole time. Finally, make sure again that you take a selfie in our photo booth. We want to say thank you to everyone that's joined us. And I am going to welcome our moderator for the afternoon, Tyler Brewer. So Tyler is an account executive at Tarquette and personal friend to me. He is great. We thank him. We thank Tarquette for sponsoring today, that we were able to make this event free registration because of Tarquette. And we just want to thank them for helping us make this very equitable for all. So Tyler, take it away.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sweet. Hey, thank you guys so much for joining and everything. Tarquette is more than happy to sponsor. And then also, thank you so much, Kim, for leading and everything and organizing all this stuff. And awesome. So to begin, I'm going to do a quick little presentation from Tarquette, and then we'll get right into things. So I'm going to share my screen, full screen, agree to share, and then, actually, hold on, I'm gonna do my, sorry, I gotta put on the audio settings, and I gotta do the, it's yesterday.
While Tyler's getting that together, just a reminder to click the link in the chat and use that virtual photo booth. We want to commemorate this event. You'll get a copy of the photo, so make sure you use that.
How do you share the computer speakers again?
So stop sharing.
Okay.
And then when you share at the bottom left, there's like a button that says like use. I'm going to say use.
Share sound. Got it. Thank you.
Exactly. No problem.
All right. Sorry about that. All right. So here's a little, come on now. Perfect. Cool. So that was just a quick little video just to get pumped up before things. This is obviously us sponsoring Pride and the Pride presentation, everything. So I just kind of threw together some colors and all, and just kind of really wanted to go through why Tarquette and why we care and what we care about, and why people like to use us so much. And yeah, so basically, why would you want to use Tarquette? Again, I didn't really want to go through product and everything, and just kind of really wanted to go over our kind of main things with us. And the first thing is, with it being Pride Month and all, we care about a lot of things. We don't just care about having a really cool flooring solution or a really cool pattern. We care about the people inside. And because of that, we carry so many different things about wellness, about the earth around us. There's a million different certifications we go after. One of them in particular is that we're the only commercial flooring that's asthma and allergy certified. Also now, just about our entire portfolio is carbon neutral. We're part of the Living Building Challenge products, all sorts of stuff. We're not just a company that makes flooring. We do so much more, and we care about a lot more than just what goes in your floors. And the other thing is also we had to make them pretty. So design and durability, it's one of those things where you're not a environmental friendly company if your floors fall apart in 5 minutes, you need to replace them every other day. So we have all sorts of really great 10, 20 lifetime warranties, all sorts of stuff. We do new designs every quarter, so you guys will never get bored by us. We always have cool new things coming out, especially since most of the stuff is designed in-house. And then we also have solutions for easier maintenance. So it's all about kind of making it easier for everyone, whether that be easier on your wallet or easier to make sure you're not disrupting the occupants as well. And then helping you all as designers and architects and all that. We realize that time is so valuable, and time is really short, and deadlines need to be met. So we're just here to help. If you need help ever with floor plans, our floors, you can make them as complicated and as easy as you want in terms of design. But if you want something really cool, just let us know. We're happy to help. It's easy for us to make customizations. It's easy for us to do really cool layouts. But in reality, we're just here so that you're not having to flip through a million different pages of flooring, and you can just call on us to do whatever you need help with. And then also, we're local. Target is a huge global company, but don't think of it as don't think of us that way all the time. Think of us as a company that makes a lot of our product either in Florence, Alabama, or Dalton, Georgia, or up in Ohio. And it's easy to work with us. If you need something custom, just let us know. If you need really fast samples, just let us know. We have a great quick ship program going. Basically, we just try to make it as easy as we possibly can for you all as designers and end users or customers or whatever. Yeah, and then the other half of this too is, with us being such a large company, we do carry pretty much anything for your flooring. If you have a problem, we have a solution, just let us know. We carry everything like wall-based to stair treads to all sorts of flooring for any type of application, whether that be healthcare, whether that be education, whether that be multifamily, hospitality, sports, anything, just let us know. And then for that, you can easily find your rep online. We have a little search portal in the top right that's just type in your region, you can find yourself. Or you can always reach out to me. I'm usually really good about getting to emails, and I'm happy to point you in the right direction and find the right rep for you. And then to end that, part of the solution spectrum thing is the fact that we carry so many different colors and so many different patterns. I thought it was kind of pride oriented. And I thought this kind of, even though there's not really much wording or anything in it, I think it's a really cool amped video just to get the colors going. And with that, happy Pride from all of us at TrekCat, especially like the DC office. We're all kind of proud to be helping out with this and sponsoring this, and it's a first time for us, for this, and it's kind of cool for us to be talking about diversity and inclusion on our CEUs and with you all, but it's also super important also for us to be sponsoring these events. So happy to do this for you all, and I'm super proud of Tarket also for sponsoring this. But yeah, cool. So moving on with the presentation, I think we're going to move right into speaker one. Is that correct, Kim?
Yes, we are.
Sweet. How am I doing on time? Oh, sweet.
You're good.
Awesome. All right, so Megan is our first speaker. Megan Hudak-Cox is a real estate attorney. She focuses her practice on land use, working with real estate developers and education institutions on a range of zoning matters. Megan is also the co-founder of Q-City, an LGBTQ commercial real estate organization in Washington, D.C. And Q-City's mission is to foster community Q-City's mission is to foster community among, cultivate connections between, and promote professional opportunities for the LGBTQ members of the Washington metropolitan area commercial real estate industry. Also, while I'm doing these bios, before we begin with all of this, each of my introductions is a very, very small little snippet of who all these panelists are, but I do encourage you guys to follow them on social media, whether that be LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever. They're really inspirational people, and it's kind of awesome to look up at them and what they do every day. So without further ado, I'm gonna let Megan take over.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. As Tyler said, my name is Megan, and I'm incredibly honored to be speaking with you all today. I want to spend my time talking about what it means to be authentic, to show up with your whole self in your workplace. First, I want to acknowledge that being able to be authentic, being able to bring your whole identity to work is a privilege, which I know incredibly well. Not everyone is always able to do so. I hope deeply that each of you are at a workplace where it is safe to be your authentic self. But I also know that some might not be in such a place. However, if you are able, I believe bringing your whole authentic self to work can make your work, your life, and your community so much better. There are 3 reasons in my experience why I believe authenticity is so key to meaningful life and work. First, because of what happens to you when you can't be your authentic self. Second, because being authentic unlocks your best work and your best self. And third, when you bring your true, full, authentic self to work, you free those around you to do the same. I came out as a lesbian when I was in college, and shortly after started dating my now wife. My senior year of college, I started working at a retail boutique near campus. I desperately needed the income from that job at that time in my life, and because I wasn't sure how the owner and manager of the store would feel about my sexuality, I kept that part of me hidden and silent. However, my manager forced me out in an incredibly uncomfortable situation. After listening to her lecture me about who I was wrong, I pleaded with her to not tell the store owner who would decide my ultimate fate in my job, because I really needed to hang on to that income. The manager agreed to keep it quiet. However, I found out shortly thereafter that the next day she went to the store owner, outed me, and tried to get me fired. However, the store owner did not fire me, and I was able to keep my job there for my year off between college and law school, which was also the year my wife and I got married. My then fiance and now wife managed a retail store across the street. She was never able to be out at work. Her boss had made clear over time that she would not be okay with a queer person working at her store. So Annie's coworkers knew of me as her roommate. She faked a friend's out-of-state wedding to take time off for our own wedding and honeymoon. We had substitute rings for our engagement ring and wedding bands to wear to work. We couldn't hold hands when we went out in public. Eventually, the stress and trauma for Annie became too much, understandably, and she quit her job. We were and are incredibly lucky that her parents, who live nearby, have loved and supported us from the beginning. And we were able to move in with them for the few months between when Annie left her job and when we moved to DC for grad school. The trauma of those events for us has been long-lived. Living in fear of your true self being found out stifles so much in your life. The idea of being able to be your best self in a job, or putting your best foot forward, or producing your best work when you are actively having to hide yourself is not fathomable. I think this is especially true when you work in an industry like design, where creativity is so key, or any industry where critical thinking is part of your job, or when you are involved in client services. While I think in every job, being able to be yourself is key, I think not being able to be authentic in these roles has a truly detrimental impact on your work product. So when we came to DC and I started searching for work after law school, being able to be open about who I was and having the love of my life was my #1 priority. But that transition wasn't necessarily easy. My wife especially struggled when we came to a much more accepting place to transition from hiding such a key part of her identity to being able to be out. But it was and is important to us to surround ourselves and put ourselves in a place where we can be our authentic selves. And we've been successful. I have been lucky enough to never have a job like that again, and have been able to come to work every day, not having to hide a huge part of who I am. And having the ability to bring my whole self to work has opened up for me what it truly means to be my authentic self. Yes, it started as a way to make sure I was safe being an out lesbian at work, but now it means a lot more to me. Yes, it means being out and proud, having my beautiful wife and our almost 4-year-old child be embraced by my work family. But I've learned that being authentic is more than that. For me, being authentic has grown into bringing my whole unique self to the workplace. My identity as a woman and a lesbian, my extreme nerdiness, my slightly unhealthy obsessions with the Supreme Court and the Constitution, my love of color coding, my enthusiasm, and my compassion. But it also means bringing my struggles, being a working parent, trying to find balance in life, mental health struggles, all of the beautiful, messy, complicated, wonderful things that make me, me. And I found by bringing my whole self to work, losing that barrier of hiding who I am allows me to put my whole self into my work. I can enjoy my work and produce my best work because I can be me. Being my authentic self makes me a better person, a better wife, mother, lawyer, employee, colleague, and friend. And being authentic, being who you truly are at work changes your community too. My favorite author, Toni Morrison, said, "I tell my students when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. This is not just a grab bag candy game." This quote has been a guiding force for me in life. And there are many ways I think we all should focus on freeing and empowering others, including making our workplaces, communities, industries, and the world more equitable places. One seemingly small but important way to do this that has ripple effects beyond what we will ever see is bringing your authentic whole self to the workplace. Because by freeing yourself to show up, you free others to do the same. By bringing my whole self to work, my full identity, I have seen how that has helped others. After encountering struggles with insurance coverage for fertility treatment when my wife and I were in the process of conceiving, I worked with my firm to create a stipend for adoption and surrogacy services to hopefully improve the experience for some LGBTQ+ people trying to create families. That's also why I co-founded Q-City, an organization for LGBTQ+ professionals in the commercial real estate industry in the DC metro area. My colleague Carrie and I wanted to create a space in a very straight, cisgender dominated industry to have a place to see our community being our authentic selves. I also try to be authentic in bringing some of my hard things to light with colleagues. I've talked about the struggles of being a working parent and opened up about my anxiety. All of these things were me bringing my fully authentic self to work. And I have been lucky to have been supported and embraced at my work for all of who I am. And I have heard from others that seeing and hearing my experience has helped them feel seen and heard, less alone, and able to bring their whole selves to work too. Being able to be my fully authentic self at work has changed my life in profound ways. I believe it has made me a better attorney, advocate, and ally. It has deepened my relationship with my colleagues and my clients, and it has made me a happier person. And I hope it has made some others happier too. This Pride Month, I wish you all the ability to be yourself, whatever that feels like and looks like for you, in all places in your life, including work. And together, we will create a better place. Thank you.
you so much, Megan. Does anybody have any questions for Megan? If not, I definitely have one before we move on. So Megan, I guess you mentioned when you were going between where you guys grew up and where you and your wife grew up and then coming to DC, and you mentioned there was some struggles about coming out and between, I guess, the relief of becoming your own selves. What were those struggles that you had to deal with where you were going from having to not be your authentic self to being able to be your authentic self?
Sure, thanks, Tyler. I think some of the biggest struggles is that when you've spent so much of your time kind of living in fear of someone finding out who you really are or who you really love, the idea of suddenly being able to be open about that is terrifying, because that's kind of been a piece of armor that you've had to wear for a really long time, and setting that down and all of a sudden being in a place where you think that you can have those kinds of conversations, you think that you can walk down the street holding hands, it feels really scary to really believe that you're in a space where that's okay. And it also requires you to relive a lot of the trauma of what happened when you weren't able to do that. And so I think that was part of the reason the transition was difficult and why it took time.
I can totally understand having that kind of armor and then the anxiety of taking it off, even though you know you can. Yeah. That makes sense. Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. And then if anybody has questions for Megan later on too, we are going to do a Q&A session, and I'm just going to keep that open too and add questions to it as we go. So moving on, speaker number 2, I have to make sure I'm on the right agenda here. Yes, okay. So speaker number 2 is Gustavo Rodriguez, he, him, his. Gustavo is a partner and design director at FX Collective. FX Collaborative, a New York City-based architecture, interiors, and planning design firm. Passionate about working collaboratively to craft innovative buildings, Gustavo was born and raised in the Dominican Republic and grew up surrounded by tropical modernism and playing with Legos. As a founding member and supporter of FX Mosaic and FX One, two of FX Collaborative's employee resource groups that support and raise awareness for an ethnic diversity and LGBTQ+ issues in the firm and industry. He is a vocal advocate for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiative, speaking at various conferences and events. Also, sorry, I stumbled over a lot of those words, but yes, I'll let Gustavo take it over.
Thank you, Tyler. Hearing that back sounds like you're talking about somebody else. And thank you everybody for inviting me and for having the patience to hear me talk. I'm gonna give myself a timer because I know myself and I tend to talk a lot, so there you go. So I have to confess that I had a very hard time figuring out which story I would share with you all. I mean, there's so much to unpack in an event like this. How do I talk about diversity, equity, justice, professional growth, design mentoring, representation? You know, it was like, do I tell my designer story about what makes me tick? Do I tell my career story, like the path I got here, how my race and culture have shaped me who I am, like my identity as a gay man, and how I have lived and failed to live my true identity sometimes. And then it hit me that if I really wanted to talk about my identity, I couldn't compartmentalize it. So you're gonna have to bear with me because I'm gonna talk about it all. So let's start with the shortest version possible, which is I am Gustavo Adolfo Rodriguez Martin, cisgender male, gay Latino, Dominican immigrant architect, partner and design director at FX Collaborative. And you know, we could end it there because that actually tells you a lot. But I guess you all want the longer version. So I was born in the Dominican Republic and I grew up, as Tyler was saying, surrounded by tropical modernism with this really fluid understanding of inside and outside and kind of the spaces that created, and living really on this in-between space, which ends up being very appropriate. And I really always wanted to be an architect since I was a kid, and it really, being an architect became part of my identity early on. And I really love playing with Legos and building new things, not what came out of the box. At one point I discovered falling water and I really loved the relationship with nature. And kind of those two things happened early on in my life. And from a very early stage, that defined me. I never had this doubt about what I was going to do with my life and what I was going to grow up to. I was like, I was going to be an architect. And those two things, Legos and relationship to nature, really talk a lot about my design identity. I really am interested in the relationship of the pieces and how the rules and bending the rules to create compelling spaces and forms. But really considering the relationship to nature and the impact that our work does on the environment, both natural and man-made. So I asked my dad about who designs building, and he basically said engineers, and I'm like, no, not who builds building, but who says how buildings are going to be. And he said, an architect. And from that moment on, I really never wavered, except maybe when my high school, college advisor gave me an aptitude test and told me that I shouldn't study architecture. And I was very concerned, and I went to talk to her, and it was like, oh, your math numbers were wrong. And I was like, oh, this woman doesn't know anything. It's all about design. So it really, it also tells you that I'm stubborn, and I really didn't want to deviate from that path. But went to undergrad in the Dominican Republic, who gave me a very broad set of skills. Did grad school in the U.S., which really allowed me to explore a lot of interest in architecture, and that's where the immigrant part kicks in, because I came for grad school and I never left, and started my career path working in firms, first in Boston and then in the U.S., and then eventually got to New York at FX Collaborative, and really discovered there and really stepping up into more of a design leadership position. Finding my voice and learning to do many things at once, and eventually, getting recognized for my work and getting promoted to kind of principal and then partner, where you learn to kind of make the hard calls and learn to be looking into the future of things. It also is a place where I started to discover have more of these conversations about race and the LGBT identity, because so far those two elements of my identity hadn't really been a big part of the story. Obviously, in one way or another, I knew I was a gay man a gay kid back then, from very early on, but I never really thought about myself in those terms. And never really thought about how those terms influenced my architectural path. And it has been one of the benefits of this moment that we're having a much more open conversations about where we're reflecting about our identities and how they shape us, not just as a hidden way, but as a very open and evident way. And I think that FX1 and FX Mosaic and the staff that were really passionate about these issues really helped not only shape these groups, but also educate a lot of us about the issues, and really allowed me to kind of start to think about how these two things, my race and my sexual identity, really started to factor in. From the kind of LGBTQ plus side, I think that for me, I first needed to come to terms with myself. And, as many queer individuals, we kind of are not sure what's going on internally for a good part of our lives. And the inner monologues, it's a very much a constant flow of things of what's going on. And it wasn't until actually much later in life that I came out. And it was not something that you talked about. I forget to say that I was raised Catholic in a very Catholic country. This is not something that you can just come up and say. And actually, things have changed since I moved out of the Dominican Republic. But it's still pretty much, it was not something you talked about. And therefore, I really grew up without any lack of representation. There was not an LGBTQ role model that I could see, not even as part of my career. So really coming out after grad school is when I really started to kind of just say, I have to be true to myself, and I have to start to live my life, and started to coming out to friends. And, I remember my best coming out story is I was dancing with a friend in a party, and she was like, oh, I have all these friends that I want to introduce you with. She's very cute and she's very nice. And it took me a minute, and I had to take a beat, and it's like, okay, this is the time to stop. When I told her, Winnie, I'm gay. And I love it because she didn't miss a beat. Literally, she kept on dancing. It's like, oh, great, we have this other group of friends to talk to you about. And that really started to take the pressure off of just being myself. And eventually, I met this guy who is now my husband, who I followed to New York, that got me to FX Collaborative. And then in FX Collaborative, I really saw leaders in that firm, like Tim Milan and Annie Rowland, who are openly gay partners at that time. Partners and principals at the time, who really allowed, created an environment where it was okay to feel comfortable saying more about who I am in a professional setting. And I recognize that that was an incredible privilege, as Megan was mentioning, because that's not something that everybody has access to. And I realized that I needed to be as visible as them and be part of the community so that we can have so others can see the representation that we all talked about. And I started to be more proactive in correcting people when they asked me about my wife, and I told them, no, my husband. I also made specific reference to him so that others felt more comfortable coming out. I won this award in the Dominican Republic for outstanding architect, which was, you make of that what you will, but in my acceptance speech, that was like, I made it a point to thank my esposo, make sure that I use the pronouns, because I wanted those people to understand that this is not just some, others out there, it's necessary for them to see it. But I never really thought about how that helped me shape my architecture path and my design until this panel. And unfortunately, I think that probably the biggest thing that I've learned and reflected is that, for a long time, I have to hide myself. And I think passing for straight, in a way, develop my skills to read the room, to understand who are allies for, who understand who is a threat, and how you adjust your behavior accordingly. And that sounds horrible, that being gay is a good training for dealing with these things, but there was a good training to deal with clients and projects. So, because you are learning to understand the situation and move yourself forward. But I think there's a lot more that I have to unpack. I'm still in my journey, as we all are, to see how that plays out. Same way in race. I think that, the interesting thing about race was my identity kept changing on me. My immigrant, it's a different experience. And I grew up in the Dominican Republic with all the qualifiers that you would assign here to white privilege. I was from, I have the privilege of a upper middle class upbringing. In the Dominican Republic, everybody looks like me and the majority looks like me in a way. So it wasn't until I got here that I got labeled a whole other thing. And I was like, wait a minute, I can see both sides of the equation. But I really, until recently, understood that the experience of the immigrant is very different than the experience of the American-born Latinx individual, where they've been born into a minority or they've grown up in a minority, as opposed to the immigrant who a lot of the times just comes from a place where everybody from one way or another looks like them, or is, sorry, background noise. I'll tell you what's happening later. But eventually that also got me into the whole conversation about more representation and why it's important. So I have become much more active in displaying my race and my cultural identity so that others can see in it that there's room for everybody in positions of leadership, and we have to make room for more people that have all these intersections that in a place of leadership. And I'm probably past my time, but just closing that, I guess what I'm really looking forward now is really to think about how, as a designer, how we design for inclusion. We've had conversations about how to bring these experiences, but how does that, all of this conversations about justice and equity and racial justice and racial equity come into, how do they influence design? What are the voices that are part of the conversation, and what are the experiences that are informing this conversation? So I really think that conversations like this one, where more people are sharing their life experiences and their path and their background and what makes them tick, is a step in the right direction. And I'm very grateful for all of you for having the patience to listen to my rant for a while. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. And it certainly was not a rant. It was great. Thank you. So actually, to be honest with you, what I was doing is taking notes of what you were talking about and then formulating
You didn't
questions.
pay
in writing.
attention. I know. It's okay.
And then, and it was so funny because you literally answered the question that I had written down here was writing based off of your work in diversity and inclusion. I was curious on how that affected your design practice and your designs and your designing for inclusion when working on buildings or working on interiors, or if there's anything kind of that you've noticed you do differently.
I think that, thanks, Tyler, that's a great question, because I really think it comes down to, you cannot define it, right? You cannot define a design for inclusion and say, oh, that design is inclusive. And I think the important thing is, it's not the design, but the process. We have to make an inclusive process where all of these different experiences are coming together, and where we can have a multiple designs. I mean, it's not the Western canon of European modernism. We have to live. We have to normalize. I think there can be like the crazy tropical architect next to the really African design and the completely Scandinavian design. So in the office, we're making a very conscious effort to make sure that we have an inclusive process, and that it's not just me, the design director, or whoever the design leader is, providing a sketch and go up and do it. And I have to create rooms and say, okay, everybody, we're going to have a conversation about design next week. Bring your ideas. Give them advance notice, because everybody works different ways. So you have to set up a process that allows for that collaboration to happen, and not just expect it to just happen out of the way. Because some people are very good at just like thinking on the feet. Other people need to gather their thoughts. And you have to create room for kind of everything to happen. And that, I think, has really come from our understanding that we each have a different process, we each have a different identity. And the more of these different identities that you bring into the process, then the more inclusive the outcome will be.
Yeah, I think that's right on the money for me too, because when I was thinking about diversity and designing for inclusion, what I always think of is, I think it was on a Target presentation I did a while ago or something, but it was one where they were saying the best way to design for inclusivity is not just design for one difference, it's to design for all the differences at once. Because if you section one out and design just for that, then that's the one thing that stands out. But if you design for all, then that makes it a lot more inclusive. Yeah. Cool, thank you so much, Gustavo, that was awesome. So moving right along, I think we're on time. Sweet, you're on time. We're gonna move on to Helen Bronston. She, her, hers. And Helen Bronston has practiced architecture for over 30 years. She is an associate with Smith Group in San Francisco and a PhD candidate in history of architecture at UC Berkeley. Helen and her spouse are parents to 2 grown children, one an artist, the other a teacher. Helen is transgendered, and though she's been out as a trans for almost a decade, has trouble writing that sentence in her biography because, especially these days, she worries how you will react. Her work has included award-winning projects for science, healthcare, senior living, K-12 education, and communities. Cool, hey Helen. I think you're on mute.
Unmute, there we go. Hi, everybody. So yes, I'm Helen Bronston. I have been in San Francisco for the last 20 some odd years, 26 years. And I've got to say, being out in a welcoming environment has been incredibly important for me. I grew up in Wisconsin, child of 2 healthily middle-class parents. I'm white, obviously. I grew up in a very white neighborhood in a very white place, and it was very easy for me to feel like I was going to be successful because my parents were very proud of me and very much pushed education. I went to a lot of big named educational institutions and did very well at them, all in my previous guise as male. I've known I was trans since I was probably in my, I did trans stuff when I was a teeny child that got policed out of me by my parents. And I'm going to keep, just to back up for a second, I'm going to keep this to be kind of a personal story because I think at this moment, while across the country, I think LGBT identities are being more and more accepted, I think that right now the trans T is kind of, and then other genders besides the binaries are really the cutting edge of where hatred is coming in this country. And it's certainly what I felt as I was trying to come out a while ago. And my story is really going to be about sort of the difficulty of confronting that kind of oppression as a person who needed to do so or was going to have to end their life, which was something obviously I didn't want to do. And I had a lot to live for. But it took me until I was in my mid 40s to be able to get around to doing it. So anyway, and some of the reasons that it took so long were that I did have a fair amount of privilege. I did have a professional upbringing. I became an architect. That was very exciting for me, but I know that that was not ever my first love. I really started out as an anthropology student in college, because besides wanting to make things, I've also been searching for a way out, a way into difference, a way out of our repression. And that is something that took me to anthropology, not sort of from the colonial white savior kind of attitude, but to say like, what else is there in the world that is a way to be? How else do people live in the world? And if you study anthropology for more than 5 minutes, you discover that the way we live in America and the West is a very unique situation, and there's all sorts of options. And I needed to believe that that was true because I knew that how I was untenable. My spouse and I have been married going on 32 years now. While I knew that my identity was untenable, I also felt that I had no way out. And I learned that at my parents' knees, like a lot of people do, that the only way to succeed, the only way to be successful, the only way to keep alive in this country is to deny yourself if you vary from the mainstream. When I was in college in about I graduated in 1985, and I went to Yale, and we had the first openings of gay liberation were happening at Yale University at that time in terms of student movements. The movement that was, the thing that happened was they had gay lesbian awareness days. And I was thought, well, that's great. There's gay and lesbian awareness days. And I was very supportive. And I've always been very supportive of that because I've needed to see that there was ways out of heterosexuality and the cisgender bind. But I also knew that I was not part of that. I also knew that I did not feel like I was a lesbian and that I was not raised as a woman. I was not born as a woman, but I knew that I'd always felt like one. I always knew that I was not a gay man, even though I was male, but I had some, internal differences going on, but they didn't fit into that picture. Later on, the B and the T were added to the Yale event, and so that was great. But I knew that all along, I felt like it wasn't that I was wrong. It was that there was really nobody else in the world who was like me. And so the importance of being a role model has been incredibly important as I've come out and moved ahead with being okay as myself in my own skin. I carried on for a long time as a apparently cisgender male architect until the early 2000s. I would find ways to express my femininity and outside of work and outside of interactions with anybody, because there was really no place else for me to put it, where I didn't trust that I would either lose my family, my job, or my life. And that kind of, there was a question earlier about mental health and coming out and things like that. It's like, man, if anything's going to mess with your mental health, it's having to be false to yourself. It's having to put on a false face. It's having to constantly code switch between what's going on in your head and what the world wants to see. And it's a double burden of repression that makes doing everything harder. So the fact that any trans person that I know gets up in the morning, gets out of bed, gets to work, puts on their shoes for that matter, is always something to be applauded, because there's so many ways that kind of burden is very difficult to bear. Coming out was a process that involved really trying to break a break from architecture, trying to say, this profession is working for me, but clearly I need some space. That's when I started to apply to these PhD programs in architectural history. I'm actually looking at a very non-queer topic in architectural history. I'm talking about the origins of the capitalist development of cities. So it's not related to that, but it hints at the fact that I still am, in many ways, a very upset at the way that the Western society is organized and the way that our society keeps devalues people, devalues experience in favor of certain parts of society, in favor of wealth, primarily. And wealth has been hoarded by white males. And that is something that I'm continually having to fight against. And architecture being essentially, in many ways, a handmaiden to the perpetuation of wealth and that kind of difference has always been problematic to me. And it's one of the reasons that I've always worked, as to the extent that I'm able, in projects that are community oriented, that are at least nonprofit or are governmental, in terms of being expressions of a community or a desire to give back as opposed to self-aggrandizement. I don't like to do corporate projects. I don't particularly like to do houses. I've had requests from friends and neighbors, can you work on my house? But I don't enjoy it because my talents, my time should be spent, I think, on trying to change the world for more people than just a family or just one person. It's been something that has come out of that. So to quickly kind of wrap up, I did come out in the early 2000s with the help of mental health professionals and with the help of actual crises, and that I found I could no longer go to work. I just couldn't do it. I wanted to work, I wanted to be useful, but all I could do with myself was sit in cafes writing about how miserable I was. And it took a long time to break through that. As I said, I'd learned repression at an early age and a lot of fear, and that's still something that I'm dealing with, is coming out against that. But in doing so, I've found that I've been able to, like others have mentioned, be more attentive to my own best, my own best needs in the world, and also to what I can provide to other people in a more effective way. We get a lot of empathy for other people in situations of suffering, being trans or being in any of the letters in this that have been mentioned today, because we know that what it's like to be an outsider in some way. I've been when I did come out, I had changed jobs finally. I was in a small woman-owned office. I'd been actually at Smith Group, where I am now, before. And I'd felt that I could not see a way forward there with my gender. And I changed to a woman-owned office in San Francisco, which had other gay and lesbian employees. And I kind of just started to change how I dressed and showed up at work. And finally, people said, what the heck's going on with you? And so I had to explain. And that was good because I was not strong enough to just come out and state it. But having done that, and then that firm work slowed up, we got purchased by another firm. And that when that dried up, people at the old firm invited me back. They said, Helen, come on back. And to be welcomed back in a place that had known me before and that also still wanted me around was very validating. As part of Smith Group, I've been, I'm now on the firm-wide Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion group. I've spoken up in meetings. I've known that we've had on occasion other trans employees at Smith Group, and I'm very proud of that. We have a lot of lesbian and gay employees. But especially the movements around Black Lives Matter last summer, like in a lot of places, kicked us into high gear in terms of trying to address difference. And I'm very proud that that's happening. I've also wanted to reach out to more and more students and more people through these kinds of events. And so thank you for having me and for listening to me rant. And by talking about sort of an own painful personal history, I hope I can be able to connect to somebody in the audience who's also going through this and say, I see you, and you can do this. You can get through to a better place. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thanks for sharing such a personal story too. Something that really resounded with me is when you were talking about being in college and everything, and having a hard time finding like an identity that fit with you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, understanding growing up in like a white middle class neighborhood and everything, and I'm sure it was very like, you had to fit into this box, you had to fit into this box. And then you look at like LGBTQ and you're like, okay, well, which box fits me? Was it hard for you to figure out?
There was no B, T, or Q when I was in college. If you know the film Paris is Burning, which is Jenny Livingston's film from the late 80s, early 90s. That was really my first vision of trans people in the media. I finished college in 1985. Jenny Livingston was in college with me at about the same time. And even then, to know that, to see finally that there were trans people in the world. Wow, okay. That was surprising. I guess I knew there were, every now and then I'd see somebody on like Maury Povich or something like that. You'd be aware that there were people, but the negative valence on that in the culture was so incredibly strong that there was no incentive to come out. It wasn't like, oh, wow, these people are having such a great life. These people were having a hard life and they were media targets. They were the butt of jokes in film. And it was, if you don't have any positive role models, if you don't see anybody, succeeding in a way beyond being identified as like that crazy trans person, let's trot them out for media attention. It's very difficult to see that as a way forward when you've been raised by a lawyer and a PhD sociologist and saying that's the kind of life you should lead. And maybe I was a chicken, maybe I was fearful, but that fear is completely valid. That fear is not unfounded because the number of trans people who die every year is immense, especially trans women of color. I don't want to say that I'm in the same boat by any means, and that we all need to be doing a better job to protect trans people of all types. But it's it's not fun. And because this community was so small and so broad, so spread out, I'd never met anybody who was trans that I knew of. I know of now 1 or 2 people who went to Harvard GSD around the time I did or afterwards who are trans, but it can't be that there's only 2. There's hundreds and hundreds of graduates, but we don't connect. It's very difficult. I know very few trans architects, especially at my level of experience. And luckily, I've been able to be involved with some things with students and younger architects. I was at an ACSA convention out here at Stanford. I asked the room full of faculty members, about 60 people, how many of them had trans students? And I'd say about 2 trans or genderqueer students, and about 2/3 of the hands went up. And I said, so how many of you have trans faculty on staff? And 1 hand went up. So it's still a problem that there's not enough trans role models for students. Luckily, there's a quorum of trans people and genderqueer people at that age that is holding itself together, but there's still a lack of role models in professional positions and in education.
Well, thank you so much for being such a great role model too.
Trying. We're all trying. That's all we can do.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you.
All right, so next on the agenda, turn my page over. We have intermission and then we have giveaway. So I will let Kim, do you want to do the giveaway, or do you want me to do that, or?
Sure. Just really quickly. Sorry, not just really quickly. Really quickly. We are going to come back at 5:01. So if you need to use the restroom or grab more water, now's the time to do it. If you want to stick around to see if you won the raffle, also encouraged. But we wanted to give everyone a break since we know this is a 2-hour event. So yes, so we did our raffle, and Tyler, do you want to talk about the first prize, and then I'll announce our first winner?
Sure, yeah, I just got your text message. So the first thing I was just looking around and like thinking about different things that would be really cool to raffle off. And if you guys know, Olivia Macaron is a macaron shop in Georgetown, very close to my office, or the Tarcat DC office. If you are one of my clients that I work with daily, or not daily, well, on a frequent basis, I am sorry, I probably brought you these a million times, but they are a local female minority-owned business, and I kind of just threw together like a really fun Pride rainbow box. So that's going to be raffle number 1. And let me read Kim's text message. So the first one is for Brian Forehand. So yay!
Woo,
Awesome.
Brian, we will shoot you a DM via Zoom, and if you can give us your email, we can arrange for you to receive that prize.
Sweet. And then the second one, I'm sure many of you have heard about this. Me and my partner are both like very big bourbon fans because of my dad. And recently there has been a distillery, it's called Uncle Nearest. And I wrote this down so I didn't forget anything. But so it's a bottle of Uncle Nearest 1884 small batch whiskey. And it is named in honor of a Black slave named Nathan Green, or known as Uncle Nearest, who carried over charcoal filtration from West Africa and started using the technology or the technique for whiskey, now known as the Lincoln method. It is also rumored that Nathan Green is the one who taught Jack Daniels how to make the whiskey, and Uncle Nearest is now the only female Black-owned distillery for whiskey. And believe me, it was between either a bottle of Uncle Nearest whiskey, or I tried so hard to find one of the amazing Pride bottles that Absolute comes out with every single year. But I thought the Uncle Nearest was a really cool thing too. So that's the second one. And that one is Kelly, I'm going to butcher the last name, Oaklison, I think, right? So Kelly Oaklison, that's the that Uncle Nearest bottle is going to you guys. Yeah.
Kelly, same thing. If you can shoot us an email, we're familiar with Kelly. We know Kelly. If you can shoot us an email, Kelly has attended and spoken at one of our events before. So Kelly, if you can shoot us an email, that would be great. And we can get you in contact with Tyler so you can claim that prize.
Woohoo!
Also,
I've had 2 bottles of it so far.
if you haven't, if you haven't taken your photo boomerang GIF on the photo booth, please do that. We have 2 minutes, so you have plenty of time to do that. We can drop that back in the chat. Dominique dropped in the chat a minute ago, so make sure you click on there and take your photos. And then we're gonna get back in action.
Cool.
All right, it is 5:01. Tyler, kicking it back to you.
Awesome. So let me get all my papers back together. So speaker number 4, or panelist number 4, or whatever we're calling it, Laura Teagarden, she, her, hers. Laura is an architect at Ratio, headquartered in Indianapolis, and the founder of L Squared Design LLC. A published author and creator of #RSketches, her passion for the profession drives her to mentor young professionals and volunteer in her community. She is a 2017 Young Architect Award winner, the 2019 chair of the Young Architects Forum, 2020 AIA Indianapolis president, and was recently elected as an at-large representative on the AIA National Strategic Council. Her website and blog offer unique insights into professional practice, together with inspiration and tips for young architects. So I'm gonna let Laura take it away.
Thanks, Tyler.
Of course.
Thank you, everyone, for having me and for joining us today. I feel a bit daunted following Helen's wonderful background and story. I would say in some ways, her story and mine followed similar beginnings. I had a stereotypical Midwest upbringing in Indianapolis, actually in Speedway, Indiana, which is, if you follow racing, I live 2 blocks from turn 4 of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. But I grew up in a Methodist family. I was the oldest child of 2, and then the oldest child of 4 when my parents divorced and my mom remarried. Both households were very conservative. I grew up in a combination of private and public schools, played sports, captain of the soccer team, your typical architecture college career path. We joked about that previously in our panelist Get to Know You. The very typical 4+2 program was the route that I took. at Ball State University, the Harvard of Muncie, if you know any David Letterman sayings. After college, after grad school, I actually got married to the military, married a co-student of the architecture program, and moved around the United States. And this was in the throes of the recession. So I like to joke that come 2010, I was the least hireable female architect in the market because I was a military spouse trying to get a job in a workforce that was severely lacking and having to move every year on an average rate. So during that time, I actually decided to start my own business, which is L Squared that Tyler mentioned, because I got tired of having to move every year and have to leave the scraps of a job that I had finally found behind me. So I decided to build a business that would move with me. And so some of that kind of strength is a key thread through my story. In 2013, after one of our moves, we actually went through the process of getting a divorce, and I moved back to Indianapolis. And so this is where the rest of that story starts to play out, right? So I moved back and am in a position where I could technically start over again. I could start to do some healing because, you know, there's some general unhappiness that obviously leads to the point of having a divorce. But I also was moving back to a place where I had history and a place that knew me. So it's not always easy to it's not just a clean slate. So in that process, obviously, as I'm sure are true of many of our stories, I took some time to go through therapy. And before jumping back into the dating scene, I did not do enough time. I look back now and realize sitting down to listen to my inner voice. I did not do enough of that early because as I continue to think through that now, I do look back and see threads of that little inner voice that just didn't have enough support through my life that may have caused a completely different path. You know, the childhood girl crushes that are just silly little things that everybody has their little girlfriend. But as Helen mentioned, in a Midwest upbringing, that's not something you do. When you are the oldest child in a household that has to set the example for your siblings, that's not something you do. But there were so many different pieces along the way of that kind of thread of strength and of difference. You know, the captain of the soccer team is one thing, but I had to get to the point of being there by playing on the men's varsity team first. You know, so there are different pieces of strength that come through there. But strength can also be that quiet, and sometimes it's a lot easier to find yourself being busy and to keep yourself busy so that you don't have to listen to your quiet. And that is definitely something that I continue to learn along the way. So I jumped back into the dating scene in Indianapolis as I'm trying to grow my roots of a young professional on my way to getting licensed, figuring out what the architecture career path looked like for me. Man, that dating life was horrible. I can't tell you how many bad dates I went on with guys, my fault, their fault, hilarious circumstances or otherwise. And I chalk a lot of it up now to just obviously not being in the right setting. Because once I switched those gender setting profiles, I'm not going to say it was like all coming up rainbows, but I was a much happier person. And so much of that gets back to listening to your inner voice and understanding what makes you happy and having the strength to kind of pursue that, and having the support of a community that will help you do that. I'm very big on mentorship and knowledge sharing. The book that Tyler mentioned is actually the ARE sketches, so the architecture registration exam. I have helped people in the process of getting my own license, helped them along the path of getting licensed. So I'm very big on that mentorship and knowledge sharing. But what I realized in the process of my own listening was that I wasn't sharing this really big piece of me because I still wasn't comfortable. You know, I was speaking to young professionals like yourselves, but I wasn't sharing this very big part that makes me me. There were definitely times where I was still using events like this when we were actually in person to kind of test those waters. You know, if I had to travel for an event, I'd check out a gay bar. If I had to, you know, go do different things, then I started to use it as a chance to explore, but I still wasn't in a position where I felt like I could share enough about me. And that's kind of just the process of evolution. We all are constantly evolving. But I would say that finally getting to the point where I felt comfortable being out in a professional setting was a huge turning point for me, as so many others have mentioned. And thankfully, my ratio family was made it a super easy process. In the process, in the time that I have been at ratio, I have seen members of the LGBT community go from associate to senior associate to principal to partner. I have seen other members of our community flourish as coworkers, and ratio has been very accepting. So that has never, thankfully, been an issue for me. Unlike I know so many others that don't feel like they can bring their full selves to work. And that is definitely something that has kind of come under my wing now as a part of mentorship and knowledge sharing, is the envelopment of this big community and making sure that we all take care of each other and protect each other, and advocate for each other. I'm sure there's so much more I could say, but I'm just so thankful to be here and listen and learn from each of you as well. So if you have any questions, that's it.
Laura, thank you so much for sharing. That was really sweet. And then, yeah, we also learned so much from you too. So one of the things I really kind of took away from this too is, or something that really struck me is the fact that really none of us listen to our own personal voice enough. I think that's an ongoing trait with, I would probably say, almost everybody. And so when you're mentoring and when you're helping others and working with others, what would be like your advice about listening into your internal voice? Like, what would be your advice on like how much to listen to it? Is it like a point where you can listen too much? Is there a point where I mean, obviously there's a point where you can listen too little. What would be your advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we all do a good job of not listening enough, and I think thankfully we're starting to move into a better sense of community holistically, where we think about mental health, where we actually talk about mental health and listening, taking a downbeat to actually listen to what our minds and our bodies need. So as it relates to mentorship for young professionals and trying to figure out what that inner voice is saying, I think honestly, and this goes beyond just the LGBTQ process of life, but all kind of passions of life, is typically I like to call it like the red thread, or like the thread through a career. And typically there is a thread through your career that keeps popping up. If you take time to sit back and think about the things you've done and the things that you are really excited about or really proud of in your life, those speak to specific points they speak to specific topics. And if you can pick out what that thread, what that kind of commonality is, it starts to tell you a lot about who you are and the things that drive you. And sometimes that means, you know, a completely different orientation. And sometimes that means, you know, kind of turning your life upside down so that it can actually be right side up.
Sounds like a red rope almost sometimes. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
All right. So on the agenda, I'll make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. So next we have, oh, and actually, it's our last speaker before our Q&A portion. A.L. Hugh, they, them, theirs. A.L. is a queer, trans, non-binary Taiwanese American architect, organizer, and facilitator who lives and works in New York City. They are a 2019-2021 Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellow and is currently Design Initiatives Manager as Ascendant Neighborhood Development in East Harlem. A.L. writes the not so regular Queer Agenda newsletter and provides brainpower and energy for queries, an ongoing survey and community building project for and by LGBTQIA+ architects, designers, and students. Their practice synthesizes organizing for racial, class, and gender justice with design, rethinks the architect's role in facilitating accessible spaces, and manifests in design, visual media, and collaborative cultural work. So with that, I will let A.L. take over.
Thank you for that introduction, Tyler.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I am going to tell a few stories about working collectively and within my communities. I personally believe that throughout our lives, the way that we move through the world and the stories are due to the stories that we tell ourselves. Like, we act according to what we believe about ourselves and the world. And a really cynical take on this would be that we have no control over what stories we learn and tell, and that we can only learn what's given to us, and that once we've learned it, the story never changes. But the neurons in our brains are plastic and moldable. And as you've heard from these stories can change all the time. If we're open to the stories that others tell, then we can change those internalized messages. So I hope that telling my story will help you tell your own story differently in the future. And I hope that all of the moving personal stories that my fellow storytellers have told before me have the same effect. So I'm going to start out with a little bit of background, starting with all the things that I learned in architecture school, which really falls under the category of rugged individualism. I was an architecture major in college, and I followed kind of like the prescribed narratives of working hard and playing hard and kind of looking out for myself, and then doing like design work for myself. And that was really amplified through studio projects, through even like the classes outside of studio, but we're still within architecture. And after college, I worked at a small firm in San Francisco for a couple of years. And I was still very much in the same mindset of like, if I follow directions, everything will be okay, like take the GRE, apply to grad school. I was trying to be like as normal as possible, doing all the regular intern things. And I was working in a small firm, so I was in a bubble. I was the only intern as well. So I was really kind of just talking to myself the whole time. But I was mostly very focused on my own path. And all of that is within the context of being a first generation Asian American immigrant. So my parents were pretty conservative, still kind of are today. And I learned that working hard and being good, for lack of better vocabulary, was the way to be a person. So the busyness of architecture school was stressful, but a very comfortable place, because I was able to overwork and obsess on projects and really stay distracted. And I really prioritized design first over everything else, like school design stuff over everything else, even my own physical and mental health, because I was so obsessed with design. And I was very like grade focused, very achieving a lot is the right thing to do and the only possible outcome. And along the way, I internalized a lot of queerphobic messages. It's really difficult to admit that I had a lot of internalized queer phobia that I hadn't even begun to think about back when I was in college and even afterwards. I really thought that there was only one way to live life, or like a few ways that were right, and that I knew who I was and that I'd already really chosen my path and I was just kind of chugging along. I thought that there were right and wrong ways to be a woman, but it turns out there isn't a right or a wrong way, and I'm not a woman. So really the path is never as straight as I thought it was, and sometimes the path chooses me. So unlearning some of these things have been a process, an ongoing process. I came out as non-binary, a non-binary queer person in 2015, which was between the first and second years of grad school. And I am so lucky to have wonderful, supportive friends and chosen family who have uplifted me. So now that you have some context about where I started out, let's jump to summer 2020. When the racial uprising started at the end of May of last year, I knew that I had to change the way that I practice architecture. By that point, I had already organized with several groups like the Architecture Lobby, Architects with 2 X's, AIU New York, and had spoken at a national AIA conference. And I had already felt worn down by the pandemic and all of the anti-transgender laws and violence that's been happening around the country in the past few years. I felt it was important to connect my work back to political power. There was an urgency to that moment that continues today that pushed me to focus on working and planning for long-term structural change. And I didn't know it then, but changing the way that I organize and practice architecture also resulted in structural changes in the way that I think about myself and work. So the first story I'm going to tell is about working collectively with Design as Protest Collective. So Design as Protest, we call it DAP, 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 is a Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian collective of radical designers who are working together to take a stand against the structures of traditional design. And from the start, DAP embraced and practiced a culture of inclusivity, participation, and action. Because we're people of color from all different corners of practice, academia, and across different design fields. One of the really big projects that DAP is still working on, we've hit a milestone, but we're still working on it, that I played a very small part in, is the Anti-Racist Design Justice Index, which is a tool for architects, designers, planners, policymakers, and community activists committed to taking action towards identifying and dismantling systemic racism within our practices, organizations, academic institutions, and local governments. I will put in the chat a link to that index. The big milestone that we hit was that we published a newspaper. Like if you're in New York City, I can give you one and we'll talk about it. But it's also available online as like an interactive website type of thing. But what's important about this project is not so much the project. I mean, the project is super important. But on a personal level, there was a lot of unlearning and relearning that was happening within community. For me, the way that DAP worked was that we have weekly meetings for organizers. We're constantly chatting with each other in Slack, and we have channels for things about joy, things about our pets, things about like venting about work stuff. And one of the really important things that we prioritize is rest. We all recognize that we can't do the work if we are too tired to do it, and we can't do it all, and that's why we're a collective. And this really helped me unlearn this this Asian American model minority mindset. Like being in that people of color only design space for the first time in my life helped me unlearn that internalized racism, realizing that I don't have to do all of the work myself. And that there's so much more to myself that I often lose when I'm really, really busy. Not just my queerness, but also being Asian American, being bringing my personal knowledge into my work that has to do with where I came from and how I grew up. So that's been a really good space and collective for me to be a part of. And I always thought that this work was kind of done by myself in therapy or something, but it was through these relationships with other people of color that I could really kind of find myself in that way. The second story that I'm going to talk about, I see your 2-minute check, Dominique. The second story I'm going to talk about is about working collectively with Dark Matter University. And I will put in the chat a link to that as well. So basically, Dark Matter University came about also during the summer of last year. And it's kind of an anti-university that's led by BIPOC, a BIPOC collective to teach about design justice. And this spring, I co-facilitated a team taught course called the Foundations of Design Justice at the University of Michigan and University of Buffalo. It was Zoom University. I didn't have to travel anywhere. And the focus was on revealing connected systems of oppression, how they show up in the built environment. But it was also about sort of the learning community that we created. Like the content, again, was super, super important. But as important was the community agreements that we had with each other about how we would interact with each other, the different types of conversations that we had, understanding how students from different backgrounds show up in design processes and spaces, and how they could integrate their whole selves within their design practices. And I learned so much through the process of creating and learning, creating that learning community, because the relationships that were built during the course were super important to actually learning the content. Through talking and discussing and telling stories, these future architects and designers could actually connect with one another. And last but not least, this third story that I'm going to tell is about working collectively on Queries, which is an initiative that I started also last year, but it really kind of took off this year. So Queries is right now it's a survey, but it's also a series of conversations. And it really came out of pushing back against mainstream discourses of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because right now it's very much like a numbers game of like by increasing the number of historically marginalized people relative to white people, you increase diversity, and then there's an argument for better outcomes and revenue when there's diversity at the table. But I believe that diversity doesn't really happen unless the people who are left out are building it. There's a phrase, a centuries-old political slogan, that nothing about us without us. And it was actually used by the disability rights movement in the 1990s as a call to action around the passage of the American Disabilities Act. So I'm like, it's 2021, so I consider nothing about us without us a fundamental part of achieving justice and actual diversity and inclusion within the practice of architecture. So, so then Queries is a survey that's made by queer people for queer people. It's not just a demographic survey. It's a process of collecting and documenting the experiences of queer people in architecture to move beyond just checking a box or simply counting people. We believe that identities are political, not merely marketing or diversifying tools, because how one identifies and how one is perceived by others can affect design philosophies, processes, and outcomes. And it doesn't see demographics or diversity as like metrics to achieve a certain level of justice through quotas. And it injects feelings and experiences and stories into the data. The survey is decidedly not neutral and rejects generalizations of queer architects and designers as a monolith based on responses. And very much like this event, it's about collecting stories and telling those stories as a documentation of our existence, like a living history of sorts. And it's really to create community and for queer people to feel less alone in a profession that is that was decidedly not made for queers and bi queers. So thank you for listening to my different stories, and I hope that something resonated with you.
Hale, thank you so much for sharing. I know on my end, I was scribbling things down super fast the entire time. But something that really resonated with me though is the whole unlearning and relearning. I think that's really difficult for a lot of us, especially when it comes to the point where it's like, hey, look, if you're tired all the time and you're working really hard, like you kind of lose yourself and then you become like this ghost of a worker kind of thing. So I guess what is, other than, I mean, that one I think is super important, but what is something that you see a lot of times that you feel people really need to unlearn and relearn, besides the ones you mentioned?
I would say something that that ought to be unlearned and then relearned is the way that we think about ourselves as architects, which is super broad, and that is like super different for everybody. But I think in our society, there is this tendency to kind of conflate like the title of architect with who we are, but really it's way more nuanced than that. I'm still kind of on my journey of figuring that out. And I also wanted to add that the way that I've presented learning and unlearning and relearning makes it seem like it's a very clear-cut process. But often when you're in the middle of it, you have no idea it's happening. And you really only figure out later when you take a step back and see where you are and kind of take stock. And it's really just like a framing, because we're all changing all the time. But it's like if you start to do those comparisons and see what has like really, really drastically changed, you'll start to see where you've learned things and unlearned things and relearned things.
Yeah, I think like honestly talking about it too is really important, but I think you're totally right as well with the thing where like you don't know you're unlearning something and then relearning something until you're like way past it and you're like, oh wait, I used to do this and now I'm doing this other thing that's completely different. I guess I just did that. But yeah. And also I feel like the architectural role and the designer role and everything is constantly changing every day. I mean, in my profession, I meet, oh gosh, like tons of people, tons of architects and designers, and talk to them every single day. And it's so interesting to see how each individual firm and each individual designer works completely different. So I think it's already there. We just need to realize that, hey, the architectural and the designer role is not this like, yeah, like what you said, some monolithic designation. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, AL. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion, if I'm correct. All right, so I'm gonna start with actually the chat or the questions and answer thing, which I apologize. I was looking at the chat the entire time for questions and I just noticed the Q&A portion, little tab thing. But so a theme for a lot of our panelists and a lot of our speakers was mental health awareness. And one of the questions was, you spoke a bit about living through and reliving trauma. What role does mental health awareness play in the professional space for both the queer community and allies? And then I'll open it up to everyone. I know that's kind of dangerous to do, but I feel like we can all do a talking stick kind of thing. Who wants to go first? I can repeat that too really quick too.
No, it's okay. I think obviously it's going to vary by the person. I mean, I guess and I'm sure other people have a different take on this, but for me, that what comes across is this idea of mental health having awareness in the professional space is that, you know, day-to-day kindness and how we work is really important with each other, that you need to be aware of where people are coming from in your office, or with your colleagues in or outside of your own office. You don't know where people are coming from. And this was something that came up for me when I was initially talking with Smith Group about coming back, was that the head of the local office in San Francisco, we were talking about, well, you know, we are LGBT welcoming. We've got, you know, our culture is open and we welcome everybody. We welcome diverse culture, but we don't actually show it. There was nothing making it visible. I think it's if you don't make visible the fact that there's are mental health issues, or that people have good days and bad days, or they're dealing, and some days they've got all the spoons they need, and some days they've completely run out. If you don't talk about that, then it's going to be assumed that everybody is just fighting their way through. If you don't talk about accepting difference and different identities, people are going to assume that they're not welcome. You need to make this stuff visible, whether it's pictures on the wall or slogans at the staff meeting or whatever. But if you don't talk about it, people won't believe that you're okay with it. So I really urge firms, leaders, to be as open as they can be about their own struggles, and also about the fact that they are welcoming to all their staff and all the problems and real people stuff that they bring with them.
I think I definitely vibe with you on that. And I think that's one of those things where I think the culture of sharing like struggles and everything is really important, especially when it comes to work. And I think the workplace needs to have this shift of, it's not just workplace, like workplace is people's lives. Like being a designer is part of someone's life. Coming into work is being part of someone's life. And part of life is sharing the struggles that you have, whether it be work struggles, personal struggles, or whatever. And it's a matter of being comfortable enough to be like, hey, like I'm having this problem, and sharing it so that other people can be like, I'm having the problem too. Let's talk about it and work out this together. And you're also not alone, kind of one of those things as well. Anybody else want to chime in?
I have something to add. Helen, totally agree with you. And I just wanted to bring up the topic of trauma too. So I follow a person called the Holistic Psychologist on Instagram, and it sounds like a scam, but I promise you it's not. And she posted a bit about kind of misconceptions about trauma and what it actually looks like in like places like the workplace, or roommate situations, or families, or whatever. And she really hits home that trauma is not about like a specific event. It doesn't have to be like this huge traumatic event. It's about how an individual perceives that event. And that's why trauma often can't be measured, or it impacts people differently, because how it impacts a person is also really dependent on whether or not that person has someone to talk to and process those emotions. Like you all were just saying, like, is it openly talked about, or is it kind of this thing that's hidden away in shame? So I think part of mental health awareness within workplaces is, yeah, really being open about conflicts, because like even little conflicts could turn into traumatic events if no one's talking about it, if it gets brushed under the rug, if it gets like internalized as like, oh, there's something wrong with me, and it's all my fault, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Thank you, Hale. All right, so I'm actually gonna keep going with the panelist questions, and sprinkle in some of the ones we had from before too. First of all, does anybody else want to chime in on that one? We're good. Okay. So another question from the audience. So Spencer asked, I have a question for all the panelists. If your state or local AIA or other professional organization asked you what programming and issues that they should approach to be better engaged with and support their TLGBTQ plus members, what would you want to see? So it sounds like
I think I can take this one, maybe, or take a stab at it. So I actually, last year, in my presidential year for AIA Indianapolis, thankfully had already kind of told our team that we would be focusing every monthly program on some facet of equity. I didn't realize how much that was going to blow up, or how important that would be in that year. But specific to LGBTQ plus programming, and I have never heard it spelled the other way, so I'm interested to know if there's a reason there. But in specific to that programming, I reached out to a handful of other prominent LGBTQ plus members in the industry in Indianapolis. And we actually were able to put together a really good program. One of the things that I think we made sure we centered it around, because so many people aren't coming from a place of understanding or from a general knowledge of the history, was we tried to make sure we really hit on the history of why it was important and of why this kind of collective community has so much to offer and is important to our larger community. So I actually, I know so many cities have these opportunities, so it could be easy to pull together in your own city. I coordinated with our local historic preservation oversight group, which is part of the government in Indianapolis, and then also with the Indiana Historical Society, who had thankfully in recent years started a LGBTQ archive wing for events and issues in Indianapolis. And so we actually put together a presentation on the history of queer space in Indianapolis and those that have since gone missing, and the importance of holding and keeping queer space in communities, that kind of both the built form and in the kind of unknown space that happens and how that shapes community. So I think when you start from a place like that of getting the history and understanding of how those spaces shape where you live, work, and play, it can be really meaningful to kind of talk about where you go from there, where you go from this point in time forward.
If I can add to that, I think the other part that could be, the other thing that AIA could do is to really think about targeting firm leadership and education for firm leadership, because sometimes there's this great interest, or there's this great kind of grassroots community that's being formed in each of these offices, and they're not being welcomed or understood by the firm leadership. And I think that not just thinking about what AI can do for the LGBT community as its own thing, but how to make things better for that community by educating leadership specifically about how you can really see this not as a, oh, I have to deal with this like checklist box, but how kind of letting that culture and really create a culture where all these people are both LGBT, women, and racial issues, or how all of these conversations that are happening in the younger AI members or the recent grads, which are much more informed about these issues, can help kind of percolate up. I've had a lot of conversations with FX is lucky to have been given the space to kind of make that happen. But I've been approached by a lot of, when we talk about it in different places where our employee resource groups have been successful in changing the culture of the firm. And I've been approached by, in a lot of cases, when I've been talking about what we do in this employee resource group, by people who are like, I have this need, I want to talk to people, but my firm is not welcoming, or I talk to leadership and they're not letting me understand. So I think the leadership is key for this transformation.
Gustavo, yeah. Cool. Anybody else want to chime in on that one? All right, cool. So I'm going to flip to another set of questions really quick, and then go back to the ones for attendees. What advice would you give to emerging professionals trying to find their voice and their authentic self at work?
I can start on this one. I think for me, the biggest piece of advice is to really intentionally think about what it is that you want to put out there as your authentic self, because I think it's difficult to really spend time thinking about how you want to show up, and I think it's really important to recognize that there is risk in, putting your voice out there and using your voice to express your authentic self. And I think that the advice that I would give, and the advice I have given to, younger attorneys, is that it's worth the risk, because it's worth being able to be your authentic self and being able to start having a leading voice in your profession. But it is important to be willing to, I think, for mentors and sponsors to be willing to help others take that risk. And I would also advise that, there's no better time than the beginning of your career to start doing it. You're not going to become a leader and then have a chance to start finding your voice and start finding your authentic self. By then, you will have been established. So I would advise people to do it as early on in their career as they can.
Thank you, Megan. Anybody else can chime in?
Yeah, I'll chime in. Slight disagreement with Megan, because sometimes you can find your voice at later stages of your career. Where like in my case, I have been much more vocal now in a leadership position than I was before. And but I agree with you that the earlier the better. So on that we agree. I would also add that as I said, FX has had a great success with the employee resource group. And I think we were not born an enlightened firm, right? That these people did the work that pushed us forward. And so I think a good advice is also to find like-minded people around you, allies or other members of the LGBT community, or whatever community you want to explore, and start to reach out to those people one-on-one. I know it's scary, and I know that not all workspaces, as Megan has attested in her story, not all spaces are welcoming, and we're in a lot of different places, and every firm has their own journey as well. And finding those allies and those colleagues will start to build community. Firms need you more than you need them. This is a big thing that nobody tells you. There's talent retention is important, and they want you to be happy, and they want you to be successful in your career. So you have the leverage. So go talk to your friends.
I could jump in. Slight disagreement with Gustavo. You don't have to do one-on-ones. I'm a big fan of learning within communities and finding our allies that way. It doesn't always have to be like a one-on-one type thing, although it could be. I'm a big fan of kind of learning within community, because you get to try different things out, I guess. And it's almost like there's more opportunities for self-reflection, because you're interacting with so many different people all at once. But yeah, this also goes back to that, the whole thing about unlearning and learning and relearning. It takes a lot of self-reflection. It takes kind of divorcing yourself a little bit from the work, the day-to-day stuff, and being what is it that I actually believe in? What is it that makes me angry that I want to advocate about? What is it about who I am and my own experience that I want to bring into my practice of architecture?
So I think if I were to put a bow on this, the thing we can all agree on is that there is no one way. Pick the route that seems the most comfortable to you, and find your community. It doesn't have to be in the office. It can be in the office, but definitely, to Gustavo's point, if your office, and to some of Megan's story, if your office is not welcoming and accepting, that's on them. That's not on you. And there are offices who will welcome you with open arms.
Yeah, I think that definitely goes back to Gustavo's point of they need you more than you need them, kind of thing. Awesome. Wait, Helen, sorry, you
Did it again, sorry. I just wanted to step in for a second to comment on the letter arrangement of LGBTQ, or changing it to TQLGB, however one wants to do it. It's been so typically written as LGBTQ that And remember, as I said, it started out as, gay and lesbian, and we've been adding letters. And for a long time, the trans community was playing a very distant second fiddle in terms of political institutions were not paying attention to the trans community. And people sometimes will write this acronym differently in order to highlight that experience and to say, actually, we're going to put trans people first for a little while. The letters actually have a meaning in the way they're listed, that changing that meaning changes your understanding of what that acronym says. Just like we're going to be talking about queer space on Thursday, changing space is never itself like this is a queer space or this is not a queer space. It's like when you've got something to change against, that's when you become aware of difference. So the currently actions in Congress have been putting trans people inclusive in proposed legislation to bring equality to the United States for LGBTQ, et cetera, people. But that wasn't always the case. So this is a way to recognize that and to try and move the discussion forward.
And I remember when I was in high school, it was GLBT, and then it switched at one point. I don't even know when it switched. But I remember like seeing it differently, and it's just like, it's all the same. Like for me, it's like, hey, I support everybody, so for me, it's whatever alphabet we want to do. I'm good with that.
Yeah. Well, when the HRC and Senator Barney Frank, Representative Barney Frank in Massachusetts, decided to leave trans people out of an early gay rights legislation, there was a big reaction in the trans community, understandably. And the HRC has certainly been trying to do a better job lately, but it was an issue for a long time.
Well, thank you, guys. We have 5 more minutes, and I am struggling to figure out which question to ask next because there's so many good ones. But I really like this one actually. So a lot of the conversations we talked about have talked about leaving hometowns that weren't as inclusive. So the question is, many of you mentioned leaving your hometowns or places you have lived that may not be as accepting as the cities where you live today. Do you have experiences or suggestions of how we reach back to help those in the professions or in schools who may still live in unwelcoming places?
I'd say the first thing is just being visible. Visibility is so much more available now on the internet and through the media than it used to be, that knowing that there's people out there is a way to, like yourself out there in the world, is a way to save a life. I've tried to go back as an alumna, I guess these days, of places to go back and say, hey, I'm out here. I can be a mentor to people, to students. I've tried to talk at high schools and things where I went to school, but back to my original hometown in Wisconsin, no, I haven't done it. I've got some friends there. I've reached out through Facebook and things, and that's one tiny way of making a community. But I confess I'm still kind of frightened. There are places in this country where I don't want to go and where I wouldn't be protected if I were there. So not that Wisconsin is one of them, but still got family. There's things that would be sensitive for people.
Yeah, I would echo Helen's comment, and I'll piggyback that in another question that's in the chat about how the LGBT community in the DR has changed after me living there. And I think that to me, the representation is really key. And I've been every time I go there or have any type of involvement, I always, I'm married to a man, so it's very convenient. I just say husband, esposo. So it's a very clear way of saying it without having to do a lot of things. But the DR that I left is not the same one now. I mean, it's much more open. It's like much more welcoming. There's a pride parade now, which I never saw ever. There was only like one really underground gay bar. Now there's much more open. So the place I left has changed. So it's a weird way for me to do it, but I think the profession hasn't. It's still very much of a male-driven profession, and kind of just being out. And as I said earlier, I can, from their point of view, I'm part of the privileged minority, the privileged leadership, and showing myself as an ally, as a gay man, kind of subverts that a bit and starts to kind of create ripples. And I think that's the most that I can do right now, short of being there and starting some making some noise.
So yeah, and I honestly, my partner's from Puerto Rico, so it's kind of almost like it sounds similar where when we go back to Puerto Rico, his whole thing is like, hey, is like if I'm out and I'm like, hey, this is my partner Tyler, and then his family sees him like, oh, he's like done really well for himself, like he lives in DC and he has like this awesome partner and stuff. Maybe being gay is not so bad of a thing, and they're more accepting because they're like, oh, he's doing really well, like he's really awesome, and he's just like through exposure, they've become a lot more open to it. Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I would echo everything that's been said. And I think for me, I grew up in a relatively rural area in Southwestern Virginia. And, you know, moving away to college was like a more accepting place, and then moving to DC even more so. And I think serving as a mentor and being visible where possible, but also I think balancing that with safety is a tension that I think is important to recognize and to talk about. And I think that it's never on us within the LGBTQ plus community to put ourselves in danger, but at the same time, where we can make ourselves visible is really important. And so I just wanted to offer that tension as well, because I think that's something that, you know, there's been a lot of discussion of moving back to places to try and change them from the inside. And I think that we should be careful about pressure on those sorts of things for the for our community.
I agree with you, Megan. Yeah. All right. So as much as I would love to continue with all of these questions, because there's so many good questions, again, feel free to reach out to the panelists. Also, thank you guys so much. I think I learned a lot today, and I really enjoyed all of your stories. They're really eye-opening, and I really appreciate you guys being here today. And then I want to hand it off to Kim.
Thank you.
To close out.
Yes, definitely. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. We are so thankful to have everyone here attending. Panelists, we are so thankful for you and for your willingness to share your stories. Once again, like Tyler said, you can hit them up on social media, follow them, follow their journey. You can hit us up at our website, equitybywield.com. I will drop it in the chat, so make sure you check us out. And also, we have social media too, so follow us. Thank you to Tyler for moderating the session today. Also, thank you to Tarkat for sponsoring this session. We truly, truly appreciate that. And excuse me. If you are interested, go ahead.
I completely forgot there's a raffle too. I skipped over it. My bad.
We will get there. If you're interested in joining the committee or staying abreast of the events that we are planning, hit us up at the website, like I said, excuse me. And the photo booth is still open, I think, for a couple more hours. So if you have inspiration to take a break from your next meeting, hit up the photo booth, do a GIF, maybe send it to your coworkers. I don't know. And finally, definitely hit us up on social media, tag us and everything. We want to continue this conversation. We will definitely retweet and interact. And finally, we are going to do the last raffle. Tyler, I think I sent you the last person. If you want to talk about the last prize, we'll get that going.
The last one is more fun because it's summer and it is time for the pool and the beach hour. So I was thinking what could be really great. Obviously, everyone needs a rainbow colored mermaid float tube and a Cheers Queers mug for the beach. So as you're sitting on the beach, feel free to fill it with whatever you like. And that is going to Scott Archer. So yay, Scott Archer. Awesome.
Scott, definitely send us an email at wieldevent@gmail.com. Others, you can hit us up there as well. We want to make sure you claim your prizes. So Kelly, Brian, and Scott, shoot us an email, Thank you to everyone. If you have questions or want to get involved, hit us up at the email, DM us on Instagram, Twitter, all that good stuff. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a great, great, great evening for our East Coasters and great afternoon for our West Coasters.
Guys.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.